Tonight, we're continuing our work of practicing the 12 steps to achieve emotional sobriety. And it's being done by Herb Kagan twice a month. Tonight starts, like I said, step 9, and it's a big deal. So for the next 3 times Herb is here, which means till the end of September, we're going to be talking about step 9. Today, he's going to set it all up with us, for us, with answering a couple questions. What is it? And how does it work? But all next month, we're going to be talking about forgiveness. So this is a big deal. And I know you're going to walk away with some important things to add to your toolbox. So it is my pleasure to introduce you to Herb. And I can't wait. Again, I say that every time you come.
You do.
It's good to see you again.
Thank you very much. My name is Herb, and I'm an alcoholic, and I'm really honored to be here. This has turned out to be just a wonderful gift to me and the resources that I have made available to the people who are interested in my work. Thank you, Susie, for setting it up in such a comprehensive way in terms of a roadmap for not only today, but for the balance of step 9, the balance of September. This is such a critically important step, probably the only step that you can't do on your own. Now, we really can't do the steps, my experience, on your own, on my own, effectively, without help, all of them. That's really clear to me because it's absolutely my experience. I tried to do the steps on my own in my first year. I didn't know much. I didn't know, my sponsor didn't know much. And so I just followed directions, which was very superficial and weak and quite frankly uninformed. But I didn't know that because I'm new. And I did the best I could, which in fact was sufficient. Please hear that. Those of you who are relatively new, or those of you who are got an inclination toward perfectionism. It's not helpful. Perfection, it's not helpful. Bill saw that page, I think it's 60. He said progress, not perfection. It was a wonderful insight. Probably 30% at least of the people who come to my workshops have the inclination to do it perfectly. And it's always just a nasty bog, swamp to get into, because as human beings, we can't do that. But back to that comment. I think you could pretty much do all of the steps on your own. Read the big book and kind of follow direction, except 9. We can't, because we don't have that kind of experience, and we're not objective, maybe 8 even, because we're not objective. We're the subject, and we'll always not see the truth or cut ourselves some slack in dealing with the truth or dealing with reality as we see it. So you can ask yourself, it's a really, really good question. Here's the 9th step. Made direct amends. Well, what is an amend? To such people, wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. So what are the exceptions? Here's the question, though. We've got over 100 people on this call. I'm asking you to ask yourself, and be honest, have you made an effort to make amends? Have you had guidance from an experienced person? It might be a sponsor, step guide, attorney, or therapist. Lots of resources are available, especially today. We're so blessed with so many resources. But ask yourself, have you actually made an 8-step list of the people and institutions that you've harmed? gotten very specific concerning the harm and even more specific with regard to what the appropriate amend is. Amend has two connotations, as at least this is my interpretation. Amend. Amend means change. Amend the Constitution. We change it. So the first connotation, of course, is for me to change. For me to go to somebody to apologize or to express regret, and I'm continuing the behavior, would be there's a word, I'm losing it. But it's certainly not healthy if in fact I haven't made a commitment to and an effort to change my behavior. Hypocritical is the word. But amend also means to repair. I'm going to mend the fence. I'm going to mend the dress. I'm going to mend the coat. Amend, meaning bring change to whatever the external circumstances are. Repair the damage. So step back just a little bit and get a kind of a mountaintop vista on this process. Here we are at the 9th step. Steps 1 through 9 are a package. That's the program of recovery, as I see it. The program of recovery, in contrast to 10, 11, and 12, which is the program for living. Totally relevant to the theme as Susie described it, of these meetings, emotional sobriety. It's not about physical sobriety. This series, of course, we talk about the steps and we talk about addiction, we talk about recovery, absolutely, of course. But the major theme and the bullseye target of this work that we're doing for the entire year is emotional sobriety. I see step 10, and you'll see that in October from my vista, from my point of view. Step 10 is the tool of emotional sobriety. And steps 11 and 12, broader emotional sobriety, that's a good language for that, or perhaps spiritual sobriety might even be better terms. We'll be thinking that through and coming up with some good words when we get there. 10, 11, and 12, and I'll end my series in September with comments about that. Step 9 is not an event. It's a process. Amends is not an event. It's a process. And it might take weeks, months, sometimes years, although you'll hear me talk about it at some point. I'm not sure today or next time. The point is to finish amends. You hear in the rooms all the time, oh, you'll never finish your amends. That's ignorance. That's people who don't know what they're doing or haven't had good instruction. Because you finish amends. I finish amends. The book says finish amends. Finish. Complete them. Well, at least for this particular journey, I've done this work 4 different times over a 20-year period with 4 different step guides. And each time I've had amends to make. Each time I have completed those amends within 18 months to 24 months. And I'll talk about that. How do you make amends to dead people? How do you make amends to people you can't find? How do you make amends to people that you shouldn't find? Difficult stuff, little twists and turns, and we'll probably hear some of that from your experience because it's broader and different than my experience. Again, from that vista, that mountaintop, look at this roadmap, the steps 1 through 9. Why are we doing this? Bill gives us the motives in this area, page 76 and 79, because he knows this is the most difficult step First time we're going out of our comfort zone to talk to people. People who are not necessarily in a 12-step program, people who are not necessarily emotionally balanced, people who are not necessarily friendly. So on page 76, he says, remember at the beginning, you committed to go to any length. Really? When did I commit that? At the beginning. Well, page 58. It says, if you have decided you want what we have and are willing to go to any length to get it. Oh, page 58. The prelude or preface to the third step. Oh, the third step is a commitment. Oh, that's right. It's a commitment with a prayer. Oh, yeah. A prayer done in public with another person. That's the suggestion, page 63. So there's a public witness to my prayer, which is a commitment to do steps 4 through 9. Why? Why am I doing this work? If you have decided you want what we have and are willing to go to any length to get it, then you are ready to take certain steps. Well, page 76 tells us the first reason why we made this commitment. Down toward the bottom, I guess it's the third full paragraph on page 76 at the bottom of that third paragraph. Remember, it was agreed at the beginning we would go to any lengths for victory over alcohol. Oh yeah, that's the reason. Addiction. It's broader than what Bill had anticipated in 1939. He was looking at alcohol. We are looking at the broad panoramic view of addiction. Some of us have substance addiction. Some of us have process addiction. Most of us have both substance and process addictions. Remember, it was agreed at the beginning. Remember step 3, he says, this is only a beginning. Bill is quite consistent with his vocabulary. We would go to any length. It's in italics, meaning the big book's way of highlighting. We would go to any length for victory over our addiction. But then, this is such an important observation and connection. On page 79, he almost repeats the same words, which is very unlike him in terms of any sense of avoiding redundancy. He doesn't like to use the same phrases, the same words in consecutive sentences. He said that's the way he was taught in English language. So when Bill in the big book is somewhat repetitive or redundant, it's intentional. It's intentional. Page 79 is not redundant, though, when you really unpack it. In the very first paragraph, reminding ourselves that we have decided to go to any length. That's a complete repetition. But now he gives us a different reason to find a spiritual experience. Oh, yeah, the antidote to unmanageability. Steps 1 through 9 are the antidote to addiction. Steps 10, 11, and 12 are the antidote to our unmanageability. That's why I use the phrase 1 through 9 is the program of recovery. Page 84, it says we're placed in a position of neutrality at the end of the 9th step. We are placed here, the grace of that. We are placed in a position of neutrality. And then he quickly says, but we're not cured. Not of our addiction. I don't believe, in the context of this writing, I believe he's meaning we're not cured of our unmanageability, the best kept secret in the rooms. I'll be talking at length about that in October and November and December. Not cured of daily reprieve. This is the work of living. So I use the term program of living for 10, 11, and 12. The program for emotional sobriety, 10, 11, and 12. If you want the program for spiritual sobriety, Just as a vocabulary, I use the words from the big book. To stay awake, we use 10. To improve our awakening, we use 11. The word improves in step 11 itself. And practice these principles in helping other people. Bill uses a term in his own story that we enlarge our spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice for others. We enlarge it. So I use that word for step 12. We awaken through the first 9 steps and stay awake in 10. And improve our awakening in 11 and enlarge our awakening in 12. That's the roadmap through the balance of the year. But I wanted to emphasize the mission here, the value proposition, the benefit, freedom. It's only one word, not happiness, freedom. Freedom from addiction and freedom from unmanageability. Freedom from powerlessness in our addiction, neutrality. Freedom from our unmanageability, empowerment. We are empowered. Bill says on page 85, the proper use of the mind, get guidance. The proper use of the will, be in alignment with reality. He uses different words. Seek God's will. It's a cumbersome phrase. We'll talk more about that as we get to it. So the key point is keep in mind the mission, freedom, and that keep in mind, I do believe that we need experienced help. Your sponsor and your step guide might be that person. My step guide was that person, but he also had the humility to say, Herb, in that particular situation, I don't have any experience. You need to go to talk to a woman, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. So I have a repertoire of people, resources that I recommend to people who are struggling with making amends. So I have a resource group of people in a program, in some form of 12-step program, who are, in my sense, experienced with it, who are attorneys, who are accountants, who are insurance adjusters, who are medical doctors, who are therapists, who are attorneys. Did I say that? Well, anyway, people who can counsel from a perspective of being informed, but also being experienced in the 12-step process. My website has what's called the Way of Life document as part of my workshop resources, herbk.com, and it will be helpful in each of the steps, but especially in step 9, and we'll talk more about that as we go through it. We're talking about dealing of freedom from the bondage of addiction, certainly, and freedom from the bondage of self, the 2 halves of the first step. 12 steps to freedom, a process to establish a relationship with power, those first 3 steps. Bill calls it a rocket launch, that first stage. We get in the rocket and it takes us where the rocket's going to go. We have some responsibility to manipulate the tools in the rocket, steps 4 through 7, so that we can establish a relationship with ourselves by identifying and removing the obstacles in us to the light that is in us. Steps 1 through 3 convince us that there is a light that is available, that is a resource that is deep down inside of us. That resource isn't me, but it's available to me. And I can establish a relationship with it by cleaning away the clouds in me to that light. Similarly, I need to identify the clouds in me that have come about because of the mischief I've created, and I'll be kind with that word, the harm's done. What is a harm? We looked at that in step 8. The harm is not my behavior. The harm is the impact of my negative behavior, the impact on them that diminished the quality of their life. So I want to remove these clouds to establish a healthy relationship with others. The 12 and 12 uses a great phrase that talks about being in partnership with others, partnership with humanity. This is a step in that direction of establishing or reestablishing. As I mentioned, amends means a change in me, but it also means a repair of the damage to them. Those two aspects are critically important to get very specific. Because, and the word healing is not, I don't believe in the big book. I haven't done a word search, but it is my experience. That's why I use it. Susie reminded us that I think she used the term forgiveness. That's what step 9 leads us to, not as an event, but as a process that began in step 4. I'll talk more about that in the 2 meetings in September, the forgiveness process. Both from my personal experience of completing steps 9 several times and understanding the process of forgiveness, but also getting then some support from science, from psychology. Many of you have heard me talk about Fred Luskin. He's a clinical psychologist, PhD, clinical psychologist, a professor at Stanford University in Northern California. He did his doctoral dissertation on forgiveness. After I had finished the steps the first time, and I had done some thinking and writing on the forgiveness process as I experienced it, I came across his work. He's a scientist. He's not in a 12-step program, and he's not particularly spiritual in the traditional sense. But he has studied the science of forgiveness from a psychological and a therapeutic standpoint. And he converted his doctoral dissertation into a book called Forgive for Good. I'm going to make a statement. So profoundly effective for human change is the big book. That's not the outrageous comment. Most of you know that. But the second best book I've ever read in my life, and quite frankly, that's quite a pile, is his book, Fred Luskin, Forgive for Good, because it totally complements the work of the 12 steps using different vocabulary and a different process, but underneath the process, the dynamics are the same. I can't recommend it highly enough, especially if, in fact, you're doing steps 8 and 9. It will be unusually helpful. More about that in September. But healing is the key word. I looked up the word forgiveness. Look at my hand. I looked up the word forgiveness in the dictionary. My dictionary says a decision to release them. Notice the gentleness, but notice the effectiveness, a decision to release them. The St. Francis prayer says, to the extent that we release them, we are released. A paradox, one of those wonderful spiritual paradoxes. You can't get here from there, but here I am, and this is the only explanation I have. The Lord's Prayer, the prayer in what's called now the Christian scripture, allegedly a prayer given to us by Jesus. Doesn't matter. The words are what's important here in the intention. And it says, to the extent that we release them from their debt, we are released from our debt. You see, 2,000 years apart. The Christian scripture written in the year 100. And the St. Francis prayer, not written by St. Francis, who was a 12th century monk, it was just written in the 18th or 19th century by somebody who understood the principles of St. Francis and scripted them into a prayer. 2,000 years apart, the dynamic is the same. And then we have the experience of the 12-step process by completing step 9, and we experience the same thing in our century. And then we get confirmation from science that, in fact, this is the human process. Nothing necessarily mystical or specifically spiritual about it in the esoteric sense. Certainly very mystical in terms of the mystery, the freedom that it gives us and the freedom that it gives them. This amends process. I've coded it now into a 4-part dance. Not because it's this listed this way in the big book, but because I followed the big book and the 12 and 12, and I capture my experience, trying to then be able to describe it so that people can replicate it. Describe it so that people can replicate it. I try to make the work that I've done visible, understandable, applicable, easy to, well, simple to do, not easy to do, so that they can, in fact, have the experience of freedom that's promised in the big book. So we make an appointment with the person. If we can, make contact with them. First of all, we follow direction from our sponsor and our step guide. Same person or 2 different people? Obviously, it's what your choice is and what your needs are and what your experience is. Normally, when this was 1988, 89, when I was doing this work, so we didn't have internet at that time, of course. And I would call people and I would say, as a general introduction, hi, this is Herb, and we were in business, or we were friends, or we were in this community, or whatever it was to give a context. And I'm doing an overview of my life right now, kind of an inventory of my life to see where I've misfired in terms of my relationships to others. See, I make up terms that are very broad, not necessarily the words from the big book. And your name came up, and I would like to get together with you if you have time for a cup of coffee or a meeting in a park or something along the lines. I try not to do things in restaurants where there might be waiters and people overhearing, so that it's a more confidential environment. Now, some people will say, because they're still very angry and they have no patience with me, they say, no, I'm prepared to do the amends right there. Now, if you can't find them, or you shouldn't find them, then there's another process. Of course, maybe a letter would be an appropriate introduction. Or maybe a letter would be an appropriate amends process. And you get some direction from people who understand the process and who have experienced a particular amend that you're talking about. If they haven't if they don't understand the process, or if they haven't had legitimately personal experience with this particular situation, find somebody who has. It's too sacred a process. We're talking about first making amends to them for their freedom. Bill puts it very clearly on page 77, the order of priorities here. This is not about me. This is not about my freedom. This is not about my happiness. This is not about my spirituality. Please hear this. Page 77. At the moment, we are trying to put our lives in order. Well, of course, it's about us and our happiness and our freedom. But then he says, but this is not an end in itself. This is not the primary purpose. Our real purpose, I'm quoting now, Our real purpose is to fit ourselves to be of maximum service to God and the people about us. A resonating theme throughout the big book. The problem, the real problem, the unmanageability problem, the spiritual problem is confirmed on page 62. Selfishness dash self-centeredness exclamation point. The antidote is other-centeredness. No, it's that simple. The turning that is committed to in step 3 is the turning from self-centeredness of unmanageability to the other-centeredness of 10, 11, and 12. And somehow that gives us freedom. Somehow that gives us emotional sobriety. Somehow that gives us the ability to progressively evolve into decent human beings. Progressively. Like the dimmer switch, it goes up a notch at a time. We encounter the darkness in steps 4 through 9. And we encounter the light in steps 10, 11, and 12. And we foster that light. And we stay gently pressed up against the dimmer switch, moving it forward one day at a time, one notch at a time, and the lights get brighter. It's an amazing metaphor that really fits and suggests that it's a progressive development, not an event or an achievement. Our real purpose is to fit ourselves to be of maximum service to God and the people about us, to clean the channel that the St. Francis prayer talks about, of the obstacles in us so that life, grace, God can flow through us, to us, of course, but through us to the community around us. Wonderful image of this journey we call life. And so if you have the opportunity there, you're asked to say, I don't have time for you, but if you want to talk to me right now, I have time. I've got 10 minutes, 15 minutes, fine. You're prepared to describe the harm. I borrowed $5,000 from you 20 years ago and I didn't pay it back like I said I would. Then, this is the second piece of the dance. I ask, is there any other harm that you would like to talk about that I didn't mention? Notice the vocabulary. Is there any other harm? Because I'm usually in a whiteout or blackout when I'm living my life because I'm so self-centered that I'm not aware of the negative impact of my behavior on other people. Or maybe there's just so much time has gone by that I'm clueless. Or, for instance, with my own family, with my children, there's so much damage that I can't identify at all, but they can if they're conscious and willing to talk about it. So, but I ask them, is there any other harm that you want to talk about? There may be other harm and they're just so done with me, or they're just so hurt that they can't talk about it at that point, or whatever the reason is. It doesn't make any difference. I'm not there to mandate anything. I'm there to suggest so that they can find freedom, that they can find repair, that they can find healing. Now, the secret here is when I ask the question is to pause. 15 seconds will seem like 15 minutes. The silence is just so uncomfortable. That was 5 seconds. 15 seconds, 30 seconds at a max, but give them time to digest the question. This is not something that most people are familiar with, even people in a 12-step program, even people perhaps who have done 8th and 9th step, and they're expecting some conversation. They might not be quite ready for some of these processes or questions. Is there any other harm? Is there any other way that I diminish the quality of your life? If you can expand on the term harm, it might open up their response to it, their memory of it, their willingness to participate in the conversation. And let them chat then, if in fact most people just want it over with. Quite frankly, even experienced people, there's just, everybody's uncomfortable and they just want it over with. Then I suggest the amends. Notice the word though, suggest. I don't tell them what I'm going to do. I say, I borrowed $5,000 from you 20 years ago and I did not pay it back. I am willing to pay it back. I don't have the money right now, or I do. If I don't have the money, I'm suggesting $100 a month until it's paid off. You make a suggestion. Then you ask again, is there anything else I can do to make it right? And then the pause again. 5 seconds, 15 seconds, 30 seconds. Don't make it brutal on yourself or the other person. Well, the response might be, well, that was 20 years ago. Yeah, I want compound interest payment added to that. That's very legitimate. Take it into consideration. If you have any doubt about their request, say time out. I will get back to you and I'll respond to you after I have an opportunity to think about it. What you mean is so that I can talk to other people about what their experience is and what is the appropriate justice. See, the scales of justice. Lady Justice is blind. How do I bring justice back to this equation of this partnership with this person? Balance of justice. I had a man who was divorced from a woman 20 years, and he had not talked, and they had a very acrimonious relationship. And she wouldn't return his phone calls. So I said, put it in writing. And he put it in writing. Don't allow your sponsees or the people you're trying to help to send anything in writing without you first reading it. He had things that were fairly passive aggressive or just plain rude in the letter because he was still filled with lots of negative feelings. So once we cleaned up the letter and he sent it, within 2 weeks, she called him and was ready to have him visit. And he did the process. He did the 4-part dance. And when he came to this any other amends part, she said, yeah, she didn't even lose a second. There was no pause. Yes, write me a check for $25,000 and we'll call it even. Well, it startled him, but fortunately he was prepared. And he said, let me think about that and I'll get back to you this week. And he came and he talked to me and we reviewed the alimony, the financial split, the child support, et cetera, et cetera. And he felt in meditation that he was clean. And based on his interpretation, as he presented it to me, I said, it sounds like she's just blackmailing you. So call her and leave a message on her message machine. Don't actually try to avoid talking to her. Just the message is, thank you for the time, but I will not be responding to your request. Because she was blackmailing him. You don't have to do what they ask if, in fact, it's unreasonable. By not your standards necessarily, but by the people you use as resources. You see, we're in bondage here and we want freedom. I was in the bondage of dishonesty. I had cheated on my expense account for every job I ever had. And at this particular job, I was there 20 years. And I was leaving that firm to go to another firm for lots of reasons, a story for a different day. So I was sitting with the highest level ranking officer that I could sit with at that time. And I explained, I'm leaving, but I have been cheating on my expense account for 20 years. And I said, and the amount that I owe the company, and I gave them the number, I won't give it to you, it was a 6-figure number. And I'm willing to pay it back over time. And he said, you know, Herb, we probably didn't pay you enough during the early years, certainly, and you've made a wonderful contribution to our company. He was very gracious about it. He said, why don't we just call it even? And he said, oh, by the way, 3 months ago, you got a company car, didn't you? A brand new deluxe company car. I said, well, yes, I'm turning it in. He said, well, why don't you keep the keys and give me $1 and we'll call it even. Now, how does that work? I'm making an amends for a 6-figure dishonesty, and he gives me a 5-figure car. No, I didn't resist. I said, thank you. All right. You hear some stuff in the rooms about owing the universe, and I don't know where they get that stuff. It's kind of new agey poetry, I guess. But I'm a very practical person. I just said, thank you. How do you make amends to a dead person? Well, this man who took me through the steps had experience with that. My father was dead 12 years at the time I'm making these amends. I had done the 4th step, and I had begun seeing my role, my responsibility in the 4th column of the resentment inventory. I had begun doing the prayer for the removal of deep resentment that's suggested in between column 3 and column 4, pages 66 and 67 in the big book. If you don't know what I'm talking about, please figure it out. Freedom is at stake here, your freedom. I had volcanic rage toward my father until I did this work. And the final piece of the elimination of the volcano was to go to a cemetery. This was this man's recommendation. Any cemetery would do because he was cremated and spread, and there was no place that he was. Go to the local cemetery, this man said, and sit there with a pad of paper and pray, of course, the set-aside prayer, and then write out your amends in the process that we've discussed. Ask for this, his spirit, your father's spirit, to be present as you're writing this. And then, and here's the key, read it out loud as if your father was present. Oh my God. I brought a box of Kleenex because I'm a crier. 2 hours later, I left the cemetery, but not after I had asked that final question. Literally, we'd had a dialogue as if he were present, and I asked that final question. Is there anything else I can do to repair this damage? And the voice was quite clear. Take care of your mother. And I left a free man, free of that volcanic lava, hot, molten rage that I'd had for decades. Free. Now, my mother had disappeared. Yeah, literally ran away from home at age 67. Because, in fact, she says I borrowed, and I said she gave a rather substantial amount of money to buy a house. Now, because of the program, I had already written the check and given her the money, but she was so angry because of the transaction that she sold everything and moved out of state with no forwarding address. Yeah. Ran away from home at 67. Left everything. The grandmother to the children. She was one of my wife's best friends. My wife was one of her best friends, et cetera, et cetera. So I knew that she got a retirement check from the Teamsters. I had connections to the Teamsters because of the profession I had. And I said, I know that my mother receives a check I'm not asking you what her address is, but would you send this letter attached to her next check? And they said they would, and they did. In that envelope, I had expressed it in that 4-piece dance, the final question, is there anything else I can do? Please let me know. And I put some pictures of the kids because she hadn't seen them in 6 years. She had gone, disappeared. And she was very close, very good grandmother. Well, in about 2 weeks, the envelope was returned to me. It had been opened. It had been read. But she was still so angry. She returned the pictures of the kids. Yeah. Breathtaking. But a year later, I got a phone call. Herbie, this is your mother. Well, hi, Mom. And she said, you wrote me a letter a year ago. I received it. And in that last line, you said, is there anything else you can do? Is that still offer on the table? And I said, well, yeah, of course. She said, I've got 6 months to live. I want to come home. Can't tell it without getting emotional. I flew to where she was and I picked her up, and a wizened old lady with just a beat up old suitcase and some disheveled polyester clothes on. And she had been stripped of everything by people who took advantage of her. And we brought her home. And we were able to take care of her at home until we weren't. And then we put her in a place where we visited her every day until she died. But she was completely reconciled with me, with her grandchildren, with her relatives, with everybody. How do you get here from there? People who are dead, people who are missing. The most powerful one was with my wife, a history of infidelity, which she knew generally about. She's in the program, I'm in the program. This man who was taking me through the work at 4 or 5 years of sobriety had the same background, the same values, the same infidelity, and he had done this work and had the healing of his family and his entire family, and he was still long-term married. And he gave me instructions from the big book. He said, on, I think it's page 71, that 81. He said, if they don't know, the big book implies don't tell them. If they do know in a general way, the big book suggests we tell them in a general way. And the third option is if they know all the details, try to avoid the conversation and go into prayer. Well, this man said, because it was a general information situation, admit in a general way, but no details. Now, she did want to know when and where and how and who and etc., how many times. And I just basically stonewalled it with the conversation that my sponsor step guide had given me. And, but I said, and he recommended, my sponsor, that we pray. Would you be willing to do that? Pray for healing. Now, fortunately, she has the same values of family and marriage. And we had 25 years of marriage and 7 years of sobriety at the time. And so she was willing to do that. But here's the drill. This man said, I want you to ask her to pray every day out loud with you. The first day, you'll pray. The second day, she'll pray. The next day, back and forth. And I would suggest to you that you pray on your knees and that you hold hands and that you look in each other's eyes while you pray out loud. She was willing to do that, and we got on our knees. Now, this man had said we don't get on our knees to get God's attention. We get on our knees to get our own attention, an act of humility, an act of subordination, an act of submission. My wife was willing to do that, and we got on our knees, and we held hands, and we looked in each other's eyes. Oh, it's so terrifying and intimate, intimidating, but intimate. Just for guidance and healing. No editorial prayers, no lots of words, no story, no. Simple guidance and healing. And the next morning, we got on our knees and held hands and looked at each other's eyes. And she prayed out loud for guidance and healing. After about a week, we were having coffee and chatting in a friendly way. And she acknowledged that the heat had begun to go down between us. And we continued that practice for 3 years on a daily basis, and then periodically after that. And we both got free. When she died 5 years ago, we had 52 years of marriage, and the last 32 were wonderful friendships. I trusted her with my money. I trusted her with my kids. I trusted her with my soul. You can't get here from there except through a process that gives us freedom. Freedom, because I'm responsible for my thoughts and feelings and behavior. Freedom, and all I have to do is release the bars in front of me, and I will be released from the bondage of self. Step 9 is making amends. These are the 2 questions. How free do I want to be? How soon? Next week, I'll talk about forgiveness. Next time, in September, I'll talk about forgiveness as a process. Much more detail that will be very complementary and expansive on what I've already shared with you. Thank you so much.